In the old house on the edge of a forgotten town, everyone knew something was wrong with it. However, no one dared to step into its shadow, not knowing exactly what. Once, many years ago, the house belonged to the Carter family, upstanding people who, like everyone else, lived their lives. But much had changed since then. According to the locals, the family vanished without a trace. As time passed, the house slowly decayed, leaving only the skeleton of forgotten luxury. The townsfolk, walking by, tried not to look at the strange building, and those who dared to enter claimed they heard rustling and footsteps in the empty rooms and on the attic. There was a shadow that moved, though the house was empty. But everything changed the day a young man named James arrived in town. He was curious, and upon hearing about the house, he couldn't pass it by. With his friends, he decided to spend the night in the old building, thinking all the rumors were just local ghost stories. What he didn't know was that the nighttime adventure would mark the beginning of something horrifying, something he could never have imagined. James and his friends approached the house in the evening. The sun was setting behind the horizon, leaving only a faint light that quickly faded, swallowed by the dusk. The old building seemed even more ominous with each step they took toward it. The few windows were boarded up, but through the cracks, dim light still seeped through, creating the sensation that the house was alive in its own way. "What do you think, James?" asked Edward, one of his friends, holding an old camera to capture the moment for his vlog. "I don't know, it looks like an ordinary old house," James replied, though his own words sounded somewhat unconvincing. The place felt different from any other abandoned house he'd been to before. Everything was too quiet. "Well, let's not waste time. We didn't come here just to stand at the door." Katie, another friend, laughed and yanked at the door handle. It creaked open, and they were met with the smell of age and dust. Inside, it was dark, but not so dark that they couldn't make out the decaying walls, covered in mold and stains of time. Old newspapers and scraps of paper littered the floor, and the air was heavy with the smell of dampness and something rotting. "Let's go upstairs," James suggested, feeling an uneasy feeling growing in his chest. He was ready to prove to himself and everyone else that he didn't believe the rumors. But the higher they climbed the stairs, the more it felt like something wasn't right. The attic, a dark, cold space nearly filled with junk. All they could hear were faint rustling noises, as if something or someone was moving in the dark. "I don't want to stay here," Katie whispered, noticing how her breath began to catch with anxiety. "Don't be such a scaredy cat, Katie." Edward smirked, pointing the camera at the floor again. "There's nothing here, just old stuff." But as soon as he said these words, a strange noise came from the corner of the attic. It sounded like footsteps. The rustling grew louder and closer until it became distinct footsteps on the wooden floor. "Edward," James called, his voice betraying him with a tremor. "Do you hear that?" Edward turned off the camera and stood up, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. Suddenly, for a moment, everything went silent. In the darkness, they could only hear their hearts beating wildly. And then, a shadow. In the corner, where there had been nothing before, a dark figure appeared. It wasn't clear. It was more like a blotch that slowly moved, taking on the shape of a person. The shadow rose and, as if noticing them, froze. Edward took a step forward, but something made him stop. This can't be," he whispered, stepping back. "It's just a shadow." But it didn't disappear. James felt chills run down his spine. Without even realizing it, he grabbed Katie's hand, trying to pull her out of the room. But Edward stayed where he was, his eyes fixed on the shadow. "Edward, are you out of your mind? Let's go," James shouted. But Edward didn't listen. He continued staring at the dark spot, which began to slowly move toward them. And then it lunged, fast and without warning. A few quick steps, and the shadow was right in front of Edward. "Edward!" Katie screamed, but her voice was drowned by a deep, unnatural crash that rang out when the shadow engulfed him. It was too fast, too loud. In the next second, Edward was gone, simply vanished into the air, as though he had never existed. James and Katie stood there, stunned, unable to believe their eyes. Edward was gone. He had simply vanished, as if dissolved into the air, leaving only a cold, suffocating fear that filled the space. What was that?" Katie whispered, her eyes wide open, her body shaking with terror. "I don't know." James felt his heart pounding wildly. He tried to breathe deeper, but the air felt thick, like tar. Every movement, every sound seemed muffled, as though the house was swallowing them whole. Thoughts raced through his mind. They couldn't just leave Edward here. They had to find him. But how? Where could he be? This was impossible. Katie took a step forward, unable to believe what was happening to them. She squeezed James's hand, and her voice cracked with panic. "We can't just leave. We have to find him." "I know," James exhaled, unsure of what to do. "But what if this isn't Edward? What if this isn't just some trap?" "What do you mean?" she asked, not understanding. "The shadow. It wasn't a normal shadow. Did you see how it moved?" James turned to her, his face tight, his eyes gleaming with fear. Like it knew us. "It can't be." Katie gasped, and in her eyes reflected the same anxiety he felt. "You think Edward became part of that shadow?" "I don't know, but we need to figure out what's happening here before we disappear, too." They nodded silently to each other, and despite their fear, they started moving deeper into the attic. James nervously glanced around, expecting something to emerge from the shadow at any moment. Every creak of the floorboards under their feet sounded like a forewarning of even greater horror. But the attic was dead. There were no sounds, no movements, only solitary beams of light breaking through cracks in the roof, illuminating dusty items abandoned long ago. There was nothing alive here, nothing that could explain what had happened to Edward. Suddenly, from somewhere in the dark corner, the sound returned. The footsteps, the shadow cast by some unseen being, began to appear again. But now it was different, smaller, much less distinct, but still as terrifying. "We're not alone," James whispered, not believing his own words, but feeling the truth of it. Someone was with them. Katie grabbed him by the shoulder. Her face was as white as chalk, and her eyes seemed to see nothing but that shadow. Do you feel that?" she asked, holding her breath. James nodded, not taking his eyes off the dark spot that was now right in front of them. The shadow began to move slowly, stretching and bending as though searching for a way to approach. And that movement felt familiar, not random, but deliberate. "We need to go," James said, but his voice faltered when a figure emerged from the darkness. It was blurry, like mist, but its outline was becoming clearer. It was the figure of a person, but with a twisted, inhuman gait. It moved too smoothly, too synchronously, as though it had no body, only an essence. "Edward?" Katie asked desperately. She took a step forward, but James grabbed her arm. "Don't get closer," he whispered. "That's not Edward." The figure began to move faster, and at that moment, James felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He knew they wouldn't be able to run. The attic had only one window, and it was too far. The shadow, dark as night itself, spread, filling the space between them. In the next instant, they were engulfed in complete darkness. "James, what do we do?" Katie whispered. James was silent. He didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. They couldn't just stand there and wait. They had to find a way out, or disappear. And when they turned to search for any path, the dark silhouette of Edward appeared again, now directly in front of them, with empty eyes and a twisted smile. "You won't leave," he said, his voice low, hollow, unlike his old one. "I'll stay here, and so will you." Edward stood before them, his figure unnaturally calm, and in his eyes, which no longer reflected any human thought, there was only emptiness. He didn't move, but the reality around them began to distort, as if the darkness itself was trying to claim them. "Edward, is that you?" Katie screamed, her voice trembling with fear. She took a step back, but her feet felt as though they were glued to the floor. It was eerily quiet, too quiet, as if the entire world had frozen in anticipation. Edward's shadow began to grow, expanding, pulling everything around it into itself. James felt his body losing all sense of reality. He couldn't move. In his mind, everything seemed to disappear. His thoughts, his feelings, his fear, replaced only by cold. "You came here to understand, but now you are a part of it," Edward said, his voice sounding hollow, as if from a deep pit. "Everyone who enters becomes part of this place." "What are you saying?" James shouted, struggling to free himself from the paralysis that gripped him. He felt the shadow's power seeping into his mind, causing him to lose touch with reality. "You don't understand," Edward continued. "This place is alive. It devours all who dare to enter, taking not just bodies, but souls. How did you... What happened to you?" Katie couldn't believe what she was seeing. She tried to approach Edward, but her legs wouldn't obey her. "You were supposed to be with us. You can't be this. But Edward merely stared at her with empty eyes, and she felt the cold shadow wrap around her, devouring all her feelings, all her memories. "Now you will become part of this house," Edward said. "Everyone who comes cannot leave. I was the first, but now I will be with you." The shadow began to move faster, swallowing the space, expanding its boundaries. James knew this wasn't just a shadow. It was something greater, something ancient and sinister that existed here, in this house. It was an entity that used the house as its shell, luring people, consuming them, destroying their will and mind. "No!" James screamed, trying to break free, but the shadow enveloped him, wrapping around his consciousness like a net. He felt everything around him become foggy and blurry. In his mind, vague voices and whispers echoed, carrying a single thought. "You won't escape. You will become part of us." Suddenly, James felt his body disappear. He could no longer breathe. He could no longer move. It seemed as though he no longer existed, that he had become part of something dark and eternal. And then he understood. It was a trap. The house wasn't abandoned. It had been waiting for new victims to add to its ranks. "Edward, how could you do this?" Katie whispered, clutching something hard in her hands. But it was useless. The shadow surrounded them both. Their souls began to dissolve into the dark emptiness. In the final moment, when everything seemed lost, James heard a sound, a faint but clear noise like footsteps on a wooden floor. In the darkness, where everything was vanishing, weak glimmers of light appeared, and suddenly, before him, as if in some distant distortion, a figure emerged. "You are not alone," a voice said, familiar yet foreign at the same time. It wasn't Edward, and it wasn't Katie. It was someone they had never met, but whose dark old eyes were filled with fear. "Who are you?" James asked, struggling to break free from the grip of the abyss. "I am the one who was here before you, and you will not leave. But if you want, I can give you a chance."